Marcus Thompson's bloodied hands froze mid-suture as the massive grizzly bear's eyes locked onto his. The surgical needle trembled between his fingers, suspended above the bear's torn abdomen where new life struggled to emerge. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not like this, not in a freezing Montana cave at 3:47 a.m. Dorothy Henderson's flashlight clattered to the rocky ground, her gasp echoing off the cave walls as she witnessed something no human should survive. Director Crawford's tranquilizer gun wavered in his grip, his face pale with disbelief. Marcus remembered his daughter Emma's final words 4 years ago. "Daddy, will you save all the animals?" Now, as Bella the bear's labored breathing filled the silence, he understood why fate had brought them together on this bitter February night. "Dear God," Crawford whispered, lowering his weapon. What happened next would shatter 3 broken hearts and rebuild them into something stronger. But first, someone had to choose between saving a life and losing everything. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The story began 4 years earlier in Chicago, where Dr. Marcus Thompson had been the city's most celebrated pediatric surgeon. His skilled hands had saved hundreds of children at Chicago Children's Hospital. But on one snowy December night, those same hands couldn't save the 2 people who mattered most. Sarah Thompson, his wife of 12 years, and 6-year-old Emma had been driving home from Emma's school Christmas play when Marcus ran a red light, texting about an emergency bear cub surgery. The collision that followed shattered more than metal and glass. It destroyed the man he used to be. "I used to save children. Now I can barely save myself," Marcus would whisper to Emma's photograph each night in his isolated cabin at Glacier Creek Wildlife Preserve. The transition from prestigious Chicago surgeon to small-town veterinarian had been his penance, a self-imposed exile in the Montana wilderness where the only sounds were wind through pine trees and his own guilt echoing in the silence. Dorothy Mae Henderson represented old Montana money and older heartache. At 78, she lived alone in a 47-room mansion that had once housed 3 sons, all lost to the Vietnam War before their 25th birthdays. Her arthritis-riddled hands now wrote checks instead of holding grandchildren, pouring her $2.3 million fortune into Glacier Creek Wildlife Preserve because, as she often said, money can't buy back the dead, but maybe it can save the living. What nobody knew was that pancreatic cancer was giving her 6 months to make peace with a lifetime of loss. Director James Crawford managed the preserve with military precision, a necessary trait learned through 15 years of watching over both animals and the memories they represented. His son Tommy, now 16, spent his days in a wheelchair, paralyzed from the waist down after a drunk driver destroyed his dreams of playing college football. Crawford's strict safety protocols weren't just policy. They were born from personal tragedy and the knowledge that someone always pays the price for broken rules. The preserve itself sprawled across 30,000 acres of pristine Montana wilderness, home to rescued bears, wolves, and dozens of other creatures that had nowhere else to go. It was a sanctuary built on shared grief, funded by guilt, and managed by a man who understood that sometimes the only way forward was to protect what remained. But the preserve was dying. Despite Dorothy's generosity, mounting costs and declining donations meant they had 30 days to find sustainable funding or close forever. 47 animals would need new homes, if they could find them. The alternative was unspoken but understood by everyone who worked there. On that February evening when Marcus discovered Bella in distress, none of them knew they were about to participate in a miracle that would test everything they believed about forgiveness, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds that form between broken souls. The approaching storm would trap them together in ways they never anticipated, forcing them to confront truths that had been buried as deeply as Dorothy's 3 sons. The radio crackled to life at 6:15 p.m. as Marcus conducted his routine evening patrol through Sector 7 of the preserve. Temperature readings showed -12 degrees Fahrenheit, and the Weather Service had issued warnings about an approaching storm system that could dump 3 feet of snow by morning. Marcus pulled his woolen cap lower over his ears, his breath forming crystals in the bitter air as he followed the winding trail that led to Devil's Canyon. That's when he heard it, a sound that made his blood freeze in his veins. Low, guttural vocalizations echoed from the rocky canyon walls, the kind of distressed calls that meant life or death in the wilderness. Marcus had heard similar sounds 4 years ago during his final surgery at Chicago Children's Hospital, when a bear cub had been brought in after a logging accident. The memory struck him like a physical blow, bringing with it the phantom vibration of his phone, the text message that had cost him everything. Following the massive paw prints in the snow, Marcus discovered tracks leading to the cave system that local rangers called the Devil's Den. The prints were fresh, maybe an hour old, and belonged to Bella, the 600-pound grizzly who had arrived at the preserve 2 years ago after losing her 3 cubs in a devastating forest fire. What made Marcus's heart race wasn't just finding her tracks, but the realization of what the distressed sounds meant. Bella was giving birth, and something was terribly wrong. Peering into the cave entrance with his flashlight, Marcus could see Bella's massive form stretched on her side, her breathing labored and rapid. Her distinctive heart-shaped white patch on her chest rose and fell with obvious distress. Nearby, a massive male bear, Kodiak, Bella's mate, paced in agitated circles, his protective instincts triggered by his mate's suffering. The scene was both beautiful and terrifying, nature at its most raw and vulnerable. Marcus reached for his radio with trembling fingers. "Base, this is Thompson. We have a situation in Sector 7. Crawford's voice crackled through the static. "What kind of situation, Marcus?" "It's Bella. She's in active labor, but there are complications. The cub appears to be in breech position, and she's been at this for hours. Without intervention, we're going to lose both mother and cub." The silence on the other end stretched for what felt like eternity before Crawford's response came, cold and final. "Protocol 7 Alpha is in effect, Marcus. Do not engage. Natural selection takes its course." "James, she's going to die," Marcus pleaded, watching Bella's increasingly weak attempts to deliver her cub. "This isn't natural selection, it's a death sentence. And if you go in there with an 800-pound protective male, so will you. Stay back and monitor. That's an order." But Dorothy Henderson's voice suddenly broke through the conversation. She had been at the visitor center reviewing financial reports when she overheard the radio exchange. "Director Crawford, I'm ordering you to allow intervention." "Mrs. Henderson, with all due respect, your money doesn't buy animal lives," Crawford replied tersely. Dorothy's voice carried the steel of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "No, James, but it buys this preserve. Every building, every fence, every salary, including yours. And I say we save her." The storm was intensifying rapidly, snow beginning to fall in thick, heavy flakes that would soon make travel impossible. Marcus watched Bella's condition deteriorate with each passing minute, her vocalizations becoming weaker and more desperate. Kodiak seemed to sense the gravity of the situation, his pacing becoming more frantic as he alternated between approaching his mate and scanning the area for threats. Marcus made his decision in the span of a heartbeat, the same way he used to make split-second choices in the operating room. "Emma always said I should save all the animals," he whispered, more to himself than to the radio. The memory of his daughter's final words to him, spoken through a hospital breathing tube, gave him the courage he needed. Grabbing his emergency veterinary kit from the truck, Marcus began the treacherous approach to the cave. The wind was picking up, howling through the canyon and making communication increasingly difficult. His last clear radio transmission echoed against the rocky walls. "If I don't make it back, tell Dorothy. Tell her some things are worth the risk." As he entered the cave system, Marcus's headlamp cut through the darkness, illuminating the desperate scene before him. Bella's eyes, filled with pain and exhaustion, met his own, but instead of the aggressive charge he expected from Kodiak, something extraordinary happened. The massive male bear approached, sniffed the air around Marcus, and then did something that defied everything Marcus thought he knew about wild animal behavior. Kodiak stepped aside, as if somehow understanding that this human had come to help, not harm. And in that moment, Marcus realized he was about to participate in something that would change all their lives forever. The cave felt like stepping into another world, where the howling wind outside became a distant whisper, and the only sounds were Bella's labored breathing and the soft padding of Kodiak's massive paws on stone. Marcus's headlamp beam swept across the cavern walls, revealing ancient rock formations that had sheltered wildlife for centuries. But his attention was immediately drawn to Bella, whose condition had deteriorated even in the few minutes it had taken him to approach. As Marcus knelt beside the exhausted grizzly, his trained eye quickly assessed the situation. Bella's breathing was shallow and rapid, her tongue lolling from her mouth in a way that indicated severe distress. The positioning was all wrong. He could see the cub's hindquarters protruding slightly, confirming his fears about the breech presentation. Without immediate intervention, both mother and cub would die within the hour. But as he leaned closer to examine Bella, Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. There, on her abdomen, was a distinctive surgical scar, old, but unmistakably the work of a skilled surgeon. The incision pattern was precise, professional, and disturbingly familiar. His hands began to tremble as fragmented memories crashed over him like an avalanche. The operating room at Chicago Children's Hospital. Emergency surgery on a bear cub injured in a logging accident. His phone buzzing insistently on the surgical tray. Sarah's voice on the other end. "Marcus, Emma's Christmas play is starting. Where are you?" The decision to stay and finish the surgery. The text message he sent while driving to the school afterward. "Sorry, baby. Emergency surgery. On my way now." "You're the cub," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible above Bella's distressed breathing. "You're the bear I operated on the night—" He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the connection that was becoming terrifyingly clear. The night he had saved this bear's life was the same night his family had died because he was too busy texting to notice the red light. Bella's dark eyes fixed on his face, and for a moment that defied rational explanation, Marcus felt a flicker of recognition pass between them. She remembered his scent, the gentle touch of his hands, the voice that had whispered comfort during her own darkest hour 4 years ago. Her massive head shifted slightly, allowing him better access to her swollen belly, an act of trust that seemed to transcend the natural barrier between human and wild animal. The sound of approaching vehicles cut through the storm's fury. Marcus could hear Crawford's voice shouting orders, the slam of truck doors, the crunch of boots on snow. Within minutes, his refuge was invaded by artificial light and human voices. Crawford appeared at the cave entrance, flanked by 2 park rangers, all 3 men carrying tranquilizer guns. "Step away from the bear, Marcus," Crawford commanded, his voice echoing off the cave walls. "This has gone far enough." Marcus looked up from where he knelt beside Bella, his hands already covered in blood from his preliminary examination. "Not again, James. I won't lose another one." Behind Crawford, Dorothy Henderson appeared, her frail form bundled in an expensive winter coat that seemed incongruous in the wilderness setting. Despite her age and the treacherous conditions, she had insisted on coming, driven by an intuition that this night would be pivotal for everyone involved. "James, put the gun down," Dorothy said quietly, but with unmistakable authority. Crawford's face was a mask of conflicted emotions as he struggled with a decision that would haunt him regardless of the outcome. "This is the man who killed Tommy, Dorothy," he said, his voice breaking with years of suppressed anguish. The words hit Dorothy like a physical blow. Her pale blue eyes widened in shock as she looked between Crawford and Marcus, trying to process this revelation. "What are you talking about?" Marcus's hands stilled on Bella's side as the truth he had been running from for 4 years finally caught up with him. 4 years ago, Dr. Marcus Thompson ran a red light on Michigan Avenue, Crawford continued, his gun still trained on the man kneeling beside the bear. "Hit my son's car head-on. Tommy's been in a wheelchair ever since, and Marcus here lost his own family in the same accident." The confession poured out of Marcus like poison being drawn from a wound. "I was texting Sarah," he said, his voice hollow with self-loathing. "I was rushing from the hospital after saving a bear cub, trying to get to Emma's Christmas play. I was supposed to pick her up afterward. Instead, I killed my own family and destroyed yours." Dorothy's weathered hand flew to her chest as the magnitude of the situation became clear. Here, in this remote cave, 3 broken souls had been brought together by circumstances that seemed too extraordinary to be coincidental. The bear Marcus had saved 4 years ago was now dying, and the man whose son he had crippled held his life in his hands. Bella's condition continued to deteriorate as the humans grappled with their shared trauma. Her vocalizations became weaker, more desperate, and Marcus could see that time was running out. The cub's heartbeat, which he had been monitoring with his stethoscope, was growing fainter with each passing minute. "Shoot me after I save her," Marcus said to Crawford, his eyes never leaving Bella's face. "I deserve it, but please let me finish this first. She doesn't deserve to die because of my sins." Crawford's finger tightened on the trigger, 4 years of pain and rage warring with the compassion that had drawn him to wildlife conservation in the first place. Tommy's face flashed in his mind. Not the broken boy in the wheelchair, but the vibrant teenager who had once dreamed of becoming a veterinarian himself. The tranquilizer gun slowly lowered as Crawford made the most difficult decision of his life. "No one deserves to lose their child," he said quietly, and Marcus understood that he was talking about more than just the bear. With Crawford's tranquilizer gun finally lowered, an uneasy truce settled over the cave as Marcus returned his attention to Bella's deteriorating condition. The massive grizzly's breathing had become increasingly shallow, and her attempts to deliver the cub were growing weaker with each contraction. Marcus knew from his medical training that they had perhaps 30 minutes before both mother and baby would be lost to complications that were entirely preventable with proper intervention. Dorothy stepped closer, her flashlight beam providing additional illumination as Marcus opened his emergency veterinary kit. The contents were basic but sufficient: surgical instruments, antiseptic, emergency medications, and sutures. "What do you need me to do?" she asked quietly, her voice steady despite the shocking revelations of the past few minutes. "Hold the light steady," Marcus instructed, his hands already working to position Bella for the procedure. "This is going to be rough without proper anesthesia, but she seems to trust me." As if responding to his words, Bella's massive head turned toward him, her dark eyes meeting his with what could only be described as understanding. Crawford moved to the cave entrance, positioning himself as a lookout for both predators and any change in weather conditions. The storm was intensifying rapidly, and he knew that even if they succeeded in saving Bella and her cub, getting everyone safely back to the preserve's medical facility would be another challenge entirely. "The radio's not getting through this storm," he reported. "We're on our own until it passes." Marcus began the delicate process of manually repositioning the cub, his experienced hands working by touch and instinct. The breech presentation that had trapped the baby bear was correctable, but it required precise manipulation and incredible trust from Bella. Every few seconds he paused to check the cub's heartbeat, which remained dangerously weak but still detectable. "Tell me about Tommy," Marcus said quietly, needing to fill the tense silence while he worked. The conversation was as much about healing old wounds as it was about distraction from the life-and-death struggle happening before them. Crawford's voice was thick with emotion as he began to speak. "He was going to be a veterinarian, you know, always bringing home injured animals, birds with broken wings, rabbits that got too close to the road. After the accident, when he couldn't walk anymore, I thought that dream was over." He paused, watching Marcus's gentle manipulation of the struggling bear. "But watching you tonight, seeing how you handle these animals, maybe his dream doesn't have to die just because his legs don't work anymore." Dorothy's hands trembled as she held the flashlight, but whether from cold, emotion, or her undisclosed illness was impossible to determine. "I never had children of my own," she said softly. "Lost my boys to war before they could give me grandchildren. These animals, this preserve, it's the closest I've come to being a mother." She watched Marcus work with obvious admiration. "You have a gift, young man. Don't let guilt destroy it." The cub shifted suddenly under Marcus's ministrations, and he felt the tiny body reposition itself correctly. "There," he breathed, relief evident in his voice. "The positioning is corrected. Now we wait for nature to take its course." But even as he spoke, he could see that Bella was too exhausted to continue laboring effectively. The prolonged, difficult birth had sapped her strength, and she would need assistance to deliver her cub safely. Marcus made a decision that would have been unthinkable in his former life as a surgeon, but felt completely natural in this moment. He began to gently assist Bella's contractions, using techniques he had learned during his brief rotation in obstetrics decades ago. The sight of a human helping a wild grizzly bear give birth was surreal, but Dorothy and Crawford watched in fascination as the ancient process unfolded. "First cub is coming," Marcus announced, his voice tight with concentration, but as the tiny form emerged, his heart sank. The cub was motionless, its cord wrapped tightly around its neck, cutting off oxygen during the crucial final minutes of delivery. Marcus's hands shook as he cleared the airway and began CPR on the impossibly small creature, his mind flashing back to another small form he had been unable to save. "Come on, baby," he whispered, his voice breaking with the weight of old grief. "Come on, breathe for me." But despite his efforts, the first cub remained still and lifeless. Bella seemed to understand what had happened, making soft, keening sounds as she nudged her stillborn baby with her massive snout. Crawford stepped closer, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. "Marcus, you did everything you could. Sometimes—" "No," Marcus interrupted, his trauma clearly triggered by the loss. "I can't do this again. I couldn't save Emma. And now I can't save her babies either." The panic attack was swift and overwhelming, years of suppressed grief finally breaking through the barriers he had built around his heart. Dorothy moved with surprising agility for her age, placing a comforting hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You're not saving Emma, son. You're saving tomorrow," she said with quiet wisdom. "That little one wasn't meant for this world, but there's another one coming. I can see it." She was right. Marcus could feel the movement of a second cub, positioned correctly and apparently stronger than its sibling. With Dorothy's encouragement and Crawford's quiet support, Marcus refocused his efforts on helping Bella deliver her surviving baby. This time, when the tiny form emerged, it was moving weakly but breathing on its own. The sound that filled the cave was unlike anything any of them had ever heard. A tiny, mewling cry that spoke of life triumphing over death, hope conquering despair. Bella immediately began cleaning her cub, her maternal instincts taking over despite her exhaustion. The baby bear, though small, showed signs of vigor and strength that promised survival. "She's beautiful," Dorothy whispered, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "What will you call her?" Marcus watched mother and cub bonding, feeling a peace he hadn't experienced since before Emma's death. "Hope," he said simply. "Her name is Hope." But their relief was short-lived. As Marcus conducted a post-delivery examination of Bella, he discovered internal bleeding that required immediate attention. Without proper medical facilities, the new mother could still die from complications, leaving her cub orphaned just hours after birth. The success they had just celebrated threatened to turn into another tragedy. "We need to get her to the clinic," Marcus said urgently. "She's hemorrhaging internally. I can try to control it here, but she needs surgery." Crawford shook his head. "The storm's too bad. Roads are impassable, and it'll be hours before we can get a helicopter in here." He looked at Marcus with newfound respect. "What are our options?" Marcus surveyed his limited supplies and the primitive conditions of the cave. What he was contemplating was borderline insane, performing abdominal surgery on a conscious grizzly bear using camping equipment and flashlights. But the alternative was watching Bella die while her newborn cub cried for a mother who would never answer. "There's a logging road about half a mile down canyon," Crawford offered. "If we could somehow get her there, maybe we could meet a rescue vehicle part way." "She'll never make it that far," Marcus replied, his mind racing through possibilities. "The blood loss is too severe. Unless—" He looked at Dorothy's expensive jewelry, calculating its potential use as makeshift surgical clamps. "This is going to sound crazy, but I think I can stop the bleeding right here." Dorothy immediately began removing her rings and bracelets. "Use whatever you need, dear. These trinkets aren't worth a life." Her matter-of-fact generosity in the face of such desperate circumstances reminded both men why she had been able to single-handedly fund the preserve's operations. The decision to attempt field surgery was not made lightly. Marcus knew that operating on a conscious bear without proper anesthesia was extremely dangerous for everyone involved. But as he looked at tiny Hope nursing contentedly at her mother's side, he realized that some risks were worth taking. "If we're going to do this, we do it together," Crawford said firmly. "You handle the surgery, I'll manage Bella's behavior, and Dorothy can assist with instruments." It was a plan born of desperation, but executed with the precision of people who had already faced their worst fears and survived. As Marcus prepared for the most challenging surgery of his life, the storm outside reached its peak intensity, effectively sealing the 4 humans, 2 bears, and 1 precious newborn inside the cave until dawn. The surgery began at 2:30 a.m. with Marcus kneeling beside Bella in the flickering light of their combined flashlights and lanterns. The cave had become an impromptu operating theater, with Dorothy's expensive silk scarf serving as a sterile drape and her jewelry repurposed as surgical clamps. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on any of them. A disgraced surgeon, a grieving father, and a dying philanthropist attempting to save a grizzly bear's life in the middle of a Montana blizzard. Marcus's hands moved with the precision that had once made him Chicago's most sought-after pediatric surgeon. Despite the primitive conditions, his muscle memory took over as he located the source of Bella's internal bleeding. The torn artery was accessible but would require delicate suturing to repair without causing additional damage. Every few seconds he paused to check on Hope, who had nestled against her mother's warm fur, oblivious to the life-and-death drama unfolding around her. "Her pulse is getting weaker," Dorothy observed, her fingers pressed against Bella's massive neck. Despite having no medical training, her instincts told her that time was running out. The elderly woman had positioned herself at Bella's head, speaking in soothing tones that seemed to calm the enormous bear even as Marcus worked inside her body cavity. Crawford maintained his position near the cave entrance, but his attention was divided between watching for threats and observing the miraculous scene behind him. "I've been working with wildlife for 15 years," he said quietly, "and I've never seen anything like this. She's completely trusting you with her life." The surgery was complicated by Bella's conscious state and the need to work quickly before her condition deteriorated further. Marcus had managed to stop the primary bleeding, but he could see additional areas of concern that would normally require hours of careful repair. With their limited supplies and the bear's weakening condition, he had to prioritize the most critical repairs and hope that Bella's natural healing abilities would handle the rest. "Tell me about Emma," Dorothy said softly, her voice barely audible above the wind howling outside the cave. She had learned from decades of hosting charity events that sometimes people needed to talk about their pain in order to heal from it. Marcus's hands never paused in their work, but his voice took on a distant quality as he spoke. She was 6 years old, obsessed with animals, and convinced that her daddy could fix anything that was broken. She used to say that when she grew up, she wanted to be a doctor just like me, except she would save all the animals instead of just people. He paused to tie off a particularly difficult suture. The night of the accident, she had been the star of her school's Christmas play. She played an angel, and Sarah said she was so excited to tell me about every detail. Crawford felt his own throat tighten with emotion. Tommy was the same way about animals. Still is, actually. Even from his wheelchair, he's constantly researching wildlife conservation programs and veterinary techniques. Sometimes I think the accident changed his dreams, but didn't destroy them. The conversation was interrupted by a sudden shift in Bella's breathing pattern. Her respiration became rapid and shallow, and Marcus could see that her blood pressure was dropping dangerously low. They were losing her, despite their best efforts to stop the bleeding. Hope seemed to sense her mother's distress, making tiny whimpering sounds that cut through everyone's hearts like knives. "She's going into shock," Marcus announced, his voice tight with professional concern and personal anguish. "Her body can't handle the blood loss and trauma." "We're going to lose her." Dorothy's response was immediate and fierce. "No, we are not. Not after everything we've been through tonight." She moved closer to Bella's head and began speaking directly to the bear in a voice that was somehow both commanding and comforting. "Listen to me, Mama Bear. Your baby needs you. She needs you to fight." What happened next defied rational explanation, but would be remembered by all three witnesses for the rest of their lives. Bella's eyes, which had been growing glassy with approaching unconsciousness, suddenly focused with startling clarity. She lifted her massive head slightly and looked directly at Hope, who was struggling to nurse from her weakening mother. The maternal bond seemed to give Bella a surge of strength that medical science couldn't account for. "Her pulse is stabilizing," Dorothy reported with wonder in her voice. "It's like she made a conscious decision to live." Marcus completed the final sutures with renewed hope, his confidence boosted by Bella's apparent rally. As he cleaned and dressed the surgical site, he marveled at the bear's resilience and the power of maternal love that transcended species boundaries. "The surgery is complete," he announced, finally allowing himself to sit back on his heels. "But she's not out of danger yet. The next few hours will be critical." The storm outside began to show signs of abating, though snow continued to fall steadily. Crawford checked his radio and found that communication was still impossible, meaning they would have to wait until dawn for any hope of rescue or evacuation. The cave had become their world for the night, a place where old wounds were being examined and possibly healed alongside new surgical ones. "There's something I need to tell you both," Dorothy said suddenly, her voice carrying a weight that immediately commanded attention. "I'm dying. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The doctors gave me 6 months, maybe less." The revelation hit Marcus and Crawford like a physical blow. They had both assumed that Dorothy would outlive them all, her indomitable spirit and fierce love for the preserve making her seem somehow immortal despite her advanced age. "How long have you known?" Crawford asked, his voice barely above a whisper. 3 months, Dorothy replied. "Long enough to get my affairs in order and make sure this place will survive without me." She looked at Marcus with eyes that held secrets. "Long enough to make some phone calls and do some research about the people working here." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Montana winter. "What kind of research?" Dorothy's smile was sad but knowing. "The kind that tells me exactly who you are, Dr. Marcus Thompson, and exactly what happened on the night of December 15th, 4 years ago. The kind that tells me about Director Crawford's son, Tommy, and the accident that changed both your lives forever." Crawford's head snapped up in surprise. "You knew? This whole time you knew?" "I knew that sometimes broken people need to find each other in order to heal," Dorothy said simply. "I knew that this preserve needed more than just my money. It needed people who understood loss and were willing to fight for something bigger than their own pain." The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place for Marcus. Dorothy hadn't just stumbled upon his identity or Crawford's connection to his past. She had orchestrated their meeting, brought them together in this remote place where they would be forced to confront their shared trauma and possibly find a way forward together. "You manipulated us," Crawford said, but there was no anger in his voice, only understanding. "I gave you an opportunity," Dorothy corrected gently. "What you did with it was entirely up to you." She looked at Bella, who was now resting peacefully with Hope nursing contentedly at her side. "Sometimes the universe provides the perfect moment for healing. Tonight was yours." As dawn approached, the 3 people who had entered the cave as strangers bound only by circumstance found themselves forever changed by their shared experience of bringing new life into the world and confronting the demons of their past. The tragedy struck at 4:23 a.m., just as the first pale hints of dawn began filtering through the cave entrance. Dorothy had been sitting quietly beside Bella, humming an old lullaby that her own mother had sung to her decades ago, when she suddenly pressed her hand to her chest and gasped in pain. The sound was sharp and frightening in the relative quiet of the cave, causing both Marcus and Crawford to turn toward her with immediate concern. "Dorothy," Marcus asked, abandoning his position beside Bella to move toward the elderly woman. "What's wrong?" But even as he asked the question, his medical training was already providing the answer. Dorothy's face had gone ashen. Her breathing had become rapid and shallow, and she was clutching her chest in the unmistakable grip of cardiac distress. The cancer that was slowly killing her had apparently accelerated its timeline, or perhaps the stress and cold of the night had triggered a massive heart attack. "Can't breathe," Dorothy whispered, her voice barely audible. She looked at Marcus with eyes that held both pain and an odd sense of peace. "Promise me something, son." Marcus was already checking her pulse, which was irregular and weak. Without proper medical equipment or medication, there was little he could do except try to keep her comfortable and stable until help arrived. But the storm outside was still raging, and they were hours away from any possibility of rescue. "Don't talk," Marcus instructed gently, trying to maintain his professional demeanor even as panic began to set in. "Save your strength. We're going to get you out of here." Dorothy shook her head slightly, using what remained of her strength to grab Marcus's hand with surprising force. "No time for lies between us now," she said, her voice gaining momentary clarity. "Promise me you'll forgive yourself. Promise me you'll let Crawford forgive you too." Crawford knelt on Dorothy's other side, his own face pale with the realization of what was happening. "Dorothy, please, don't leave us now, not when we've come so far." "I'm already dying, James," she said, turning her head toward him with effort. "The cancer was going to take me anyway." At least this way, I get to choose how I spend my final moments." She looked toward Bella and Hope, who seemed unaware of the human drama unfolding nearby. "I get to see new life beginning instead of watching old life fade away in a hospital bed." Marcus found himself torn between two patients: Dorothy, who needed immediate cardiac care, and Bella, who was still recovering from surgery and could destabilize at any moment. The choice was impossible, the kind of medical triage decision that had haunted him since his days as a trauma surgeon. "Take care of the bear," Dorothy said, somehow sensing his dilemma. "She's just beginning to live." "I've already had my time." But Marcus couldn't abandon Dorothy, couldn't let another person die on his watch without fighting for them. He began administering basic cardiac support, trying to stabilize her heart rhythm and blood pressure using the limited supplies in his emergency kit. Crawford helped by elevating her legs and trying to keep her warm with their remaining blankets. "This is all wrong," Marcus said, his voice breaking with frustration and grief. "I should be able to save you. I should be able to save everyone." Dorothy's breathing became more labored, but she managed to speak again. "Marcus, listen to me. Some things aren't meant to be saved. Some things are meant to be given." She gestured weakly toward Hope, who was still nursing peacefully at her mother's side. "I've been selfish my whole life, keeping all my love and money to myself because I was afraid of losing more than I already had." Crawford leaned closer, tears streaming down his face as he realized they were losing her. "You weren't selfish, Dorothy. You saved this entire preserve. You saved all of us." "I tried to buy my way out of grief," Dorothy continued, each word an obvious effort. "But tonight, watching you two work together, seeing that baby bear take her first breaths, I finally understand what my boys would have wanted me to do with my life." She looked directly at Marcus. "They would have wanted me to help other parents not lose their children." The final moments came quickly. Dorothy's hand, which had been gripping Marcus's with surprising strength, gradually relaxed. Her breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, began to slow and then stopped altogether. At 4:47 a.m., as the storm outside finally began to calm, Dorothy Mae Henderson died with her eyes fixed on the small miracle of Hope nursing at her mother's side. The silence that followed was profound and terrible. Marcus checked for a pulse he knew he wouldn't find while Crawford closed Dorothy's eyes with gentle fingers. Even Bella seemed to sense the gravity of what had occurred, raising her massive head to look toward the spot where Dorothy lay still. "She chose this," Crawford said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "She chose to be here with us, helping save Bella instead of dying alone in some sterile hospital room." Marcus felt the familiar weight of guilt and failure settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. "I should have done more. I should have been able to save her." "She didn't want to be saved," Crawford replied firmly. "She wanted to save us, both of us." He looked at Marcus with eyes that held no accusation, only understanding. "She brought us together for a reason, Marcus. Don't dishonor her sacrifice by wallowing in guilt." But Marcus was spiraling into the same dark place that had consumed him after Emma's death. "Everyone I touch dies," he said, his voice hollow. "Emma, my patients, and now Dorothy. Maybe I should have died in that car crash instead of Sarah." The sound of approaching helicopters cut through the early morning air, signaling that rescue was finally at hand. But for Marcus, the arrival of help felt like another failure. Too little, too late. Just like everything else in his life since the accident. Crawford stood and placed a firm hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Dorothy spent her last hour watching you perform a miracle," he said. "She died knowing that Hope would live because of your skill and courage. Don't you dare turn that into something shameful." As the rescue team's voices echoed from outside the cave, Marcus looked at Bella and Hope, both alive and stable thanks to his intervention. But all he could see was Dorothy's still form, another person he had failed to save despite his medical training and desperate efforts. The tragedy of Dorothy's death cast a shadow over what should have been a celebration of new life, leaving Marcus more broken than before and questioning whether his attempts to heal others were actually a curse that brought death to those around him. The rescue helicopter touched down at 6:15 a.m., its rotors churning up clouds of fresh snow as Sheriff Patricia Williams led a team of paramedics and wildlife specialists into the cave. Patricia was Dorothy's goddaughter, a tough woman in her 40s who had inherited both her godmother's fierce determination and her deep love for the preserve. What she found inside the cave would stay with her for the rest of her life. Marcus sat beside Dorothy's body, his face a mask of devastation and self-blame. Crawford stood nearby, maintaining a protective vigil over both the grieving doctor and the Bear family that had somehow survived the night's ordeal. Bella was weak but stable, with Hope nursing contentedly at her side, completely oblivious to the human tragedy that had unfolded around her birth. "We were too late," Marcus said to Patricia, his voice hollow with defeat. "I couldn't save her. Just like I couldn't save Emma, just like I can't save anyone who matters." Patricia knelt beside her godmother's body, her own eyes filling with tears as she took in the peaceful expression on Dorothy's face. "No, Marcus," she said firmly. "You were exactly on time. Dorothy died doing what she always wanted to do, helping something beautiful come into the world." As the paramedics began their examination of Dorothy's body, Patricia pulled a sealed envelope from her jacket pocket. "She gave me this 3 months ago with specific instructions to open it only if she died while at the preserve." Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal and began to read Dorothy's final message aloud. "If you're reading this, it means I got my wish. To die somewhere meaningful, surrounded by the life I've tried to protect. Marcus, you beautiful broken man, stop blaming yourself for every death and start taking credit for every life you've saved. Crawford, forgive him not because he deserves it, but because you both need it. The bears you saved tonight will have cubs of their own someday, and their cubs will have cubs, all because you chose love over fear." Patricia's voice broke as she continued reading. "I'm leaving my entire estate to the preserve, but with conditions. Marcus Thompson will serve as head veterinarian for life, with a salary that ensures he never has to leave for financial reasons. James Crawford will continue as director, but with a new mandate: to create a wildlife rehabilitation program that brings hope to broken animals and broken people alike." The revelation hit both men like a thunderbolt. Dorothy hadn't just known about their shared past, she had planned for their shared future. Her death wasn't a tragedy to be mourned, but a gift to be honored, a final act of love from a woman who had spent her life trying to heal the wounds that war and accident had inflicted on the people she cared about. "There's more," Patricia continued, her voice steadying as she read the final paragraph. "The video footage from Crawford's body camera last night will be released to the media with my express permission. The world needs to see what happens when broken people choose to save something instead of destroying it. And Marcus, Emma would be so proud to know that her daddy finally learned to save all the animals." The body camera. In all the drama and grief of the night, Crawford had forgotten that he had been recording everything from the moment he entered the cave. The entire miraculous birth, Dorothy's sacrifice, and Marcus's incredible surgical skills had been captured in high definition, creating a record of events that would soon captivate the world. Crawford slowly removed the camera from his vest and handed it to Patricia. "She planned all of this, didn't she?" "The timing," bringing us together, even her own death." Patricia nodded, wiping tears from her eyes as she looked at her godmother's peaceful face. "Dorothy always said that the best love stories weren't about romance, they were about broken people finding ways to heal each other. She orchestrated your healing, but she couldn't orchestrate the miracle. That was all you." As the wildlife specialists prepared to transport Bella and Hope to the preserve's medical facility, Marcus finally began to understand the full scope of what Dorothy had done. She had researched his background, discovered his connection to Crawford's family, and maneuvered them both into positions where they would be forced to confront their shared trauma and find a way forward together. "She knew I killed Tommy," Marcus said to Crawford, the words still painful to speak. "She knew, and she hired me anyway." Crawford looked at his former enemy with eyes that held something Marcus hadn't seen in years. Forgiveness. "She also knew that Tommy sent me a letter 3 months ago asking me to find you and tell you he didn't blame you for the accident." Crawford pulled a worn envelope from his pocket, obviously read and reread many times. "He said he'd been researching you online, following your work at the preserve. He wanted you to know that he's going to veterinary school next year, inspired by watching you save animals despite your own pain." The letter from Tommy was brief but devastating in its compassion. "Dr. Thompson," it read, "I don't remember much about the accident, but I remember you staying with me until the ambulance came, telling me I was going to be okay. You were right. I am okay. Different, but okay. My dad needs to forgive you so he can forgive himself for letting me go to that party. And you need to forgive yourself so you can keep saving lives. Animals need you, and broken people like us need to see that healing is possible." Marcus read the letter twice, his hands shaking with a mixture of grief and something that might have been hope. "How long have you had this?" 3 months, Crawford admitted. "I was too angry to give it to you, too proud to admit that my 16-year-old son was wiser than I was." He looked toward Bella and Hope, who were being carefully loaded onto a transport gurney. "But watching you last night, seeing you risk everything to save her, I realized Tommy was right. You're not the monster I wanted you to be. You're just a man trying to make amends for a terrible mistake." The final revelation came when Patricia showed them the updated preserve charter that Dorothy had filed with the state just 1 week before her death. The Glacier Creek Wildlife Preserve was now officially renamed the Dorothy May Henderson Center for Wildlife Rehabilitation and Human Healing, with a mission statement that explicitly included helping people recover from trauma through service to animals. "She turned her money into something eternal," Patricia explained, "a place where broken things come to heal, animals and people alike. The endowment is large enough to operate in perpetuity, and the publicity from last night's events will bring in donations and volunteers from around the world." As they prepared to leave the cave where so much had changed in a single night, Marcus took one last look around the space that had become a delivery room, an operating theater, and a deathbed. The morning sun was streaming through the entrance now, illuminating the spot where Dorothy had died, where hope had been born, and where 2 men had finally found a way to forgive each other and themselves. "She got her miracle," Crawford said softly, understanding finally dawning in his voice. "Not the kind she expected, but exactly the kind she needed. Dorothy spent her whole life trying to bring her sons back from the dead. Instead, she brought us back to life." The helicopter lifted off at 8:30 a.m., carrying the survivors of the longest night of their lives back to a world that would soon be captivated by their story. But more importantly, it carried them back to a future that Dorothy May Henderson had carefully crafted, a future where healing was possible, forgiveness was attainable, and hope could be born even in the darkest of circumstances. Below them, the cave stood empty but not forgotten, a sacred space where 3 broken souls had found their way back to wholeness through the simple act of choosing love over fear, service over selfishness, and hope over despair. 6 months after that transformative February night, the Dorothy May Henderson Center for Wildlife Rehabilitation and Human Healing had become the most famous animal preserve in North America. The body camera footage of Marcus performing surgery on Bella while Dorothy lay dying had gone viral within hours of its release, generating over 50 million views and inspiring donations from around the world. The hashtag #BearBirthMiracle had trended globally for weeks, but more importantly, it had brought hope to countless people struggling with their own guilt and grief. Marcus stood in the newly constructed medical facility, watching through the observation window as Bella played with Hope in their spacious enclosure. The cub had grown into a healthy, curious 6-month-old bear who showed no fear of humans and seemed to possess an unusual intelligence that reminded Marcus daily of the miracle of her birth. Visitors came from every continent to see the famous bear family, but Marcus knew they were really coming to witness something deeper, proof that healing was possible even in the darkest circumstances. The preserve had expanded to encompass 50,000 acres, with state-of-the-art facilities that rivaled those of major zoos and research institutions. But the real transformation had been in the people who worked there. Crawford had implemented Dorothy's vision of combining animal rehabilitation with human healing, creating a program where military veterans, trauma survivors, and people struggling with depression or addiction could find purpose through caring for injured wildlife. Tommy Crawford had been one of the first participants in the program. Now 18 and preparing for his freshman year at Colorado State University's veterinary school, he spent his summer days working alongside Marcus, learning surgical techniques and animal behavior with the enthusiasm his father remembered from before the accident. The wheelchair that had once seemed like a symbol of limitation had become just another tool, modified with all-terrain wheels that allowed Tommy to navigate the preserve's varied landscape with ease. "Dr. Thompson," Tommy called from across the medical facility, his voice carrying the excitement that never seemed to dim when he was working with animals. "The new bear cub from Alaska is responding well to the antibiotic treatment. Her appetite is back, and she started playing with the enrichment toys." Marcus smiled, remembering Emma's similar enthusiasm for every rescued animal that had come through their household. The parallel wasn't painful anymore. Instead, it felt like a gift, a way for his daughter's spirit to live on through the work they were doing here. "That's excellent news, Tommy. Why don't you update her care chart and schedule her for a weight check tomorrow?" The financial transformation of the preserve had been nothing short of miraculous. Dorothy's initial bequest of $47 million had been augmented by an additional $12 million in donations generated by the viral video and ongoing media attention. Corporate sponsors had lined up to support the center's mission, understanding that associating their brands with such a powerful story of redemption would resonate with customers around the world. But the real success stories weren't measured in dollars or media coverage. They were measured in lives saved and souls healed. Marcus had received thousands of letters from people who had seen the video and found the courage to seek help for their own trauma, to forgive themselves for past mistakes, or to reach out to family members they had hurt or been hurt by. One letter in particular had moved him to tears. It came from a woman in Ohio whose husband had been killed in a car accident caused by a texting teenager. "I hated that boy for 3 years," she wrote. "I wanted him to suffer the way I was suffering. But when I saw you risk your life to save that bear, when I heard about how you've dedicated your life to healing despite your own pain, I realized that my hatred was only hurting me. I met with the young man last week, and I told him I forgave him. For the first time since my husband died, I feel like I can breathe again." Crawford approached the observation window carrying a clipboard thick with reports and requests. The preserve now employed 43 full-time staff members and hosted over 200 volunteers, making it one of the largest wildlife rehabilitation centers in the country. "The National Geographic crew wants to do a follow-up documentary," he said, joining Marcus in watching Bella and Hope. "They're particularly interested in the therapy program and how we're measuring success rates." Marcus nodded absently, his attention captured by Hope's playful antics as she tumbled with a large rubber ball. "What do you think Dorothy would say about all this attention?" Crawford was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "I think she'd be amazed by the scope of what we've built, but not surprised. She always believed that one act of genuine love could ripple outward and change the world." He gestured toward the visitor center, where families were gathering for the afternoon educational program. "Look at all those children learning about wildlife conservation and compassion. Some of them will become veterinarians or wildlife biologists because of what they see here today." The therapy programs had exceeded everyone's expectations. Military veterans who had struggled with PTSD for decades found peace in caring for injured eagles and wolves. Former drug addicts discovered purpose in nursing abandoned bear cubs back to health. Families torn apart by tragedy learned to communicate again while working together to build habitats for rescued animals. The waiting list for program participation was now 6 months long, with people traveling from across the globe to experience what media outlets had dubbed the Montana Miracle. Patricia Williams, now serving as the preserve's executive director, joined them at the observation window. As Dorothy's goddaughter, she had inherited not just her administrative duties, but also her gift for seeing the bigger picture. "The university partnership is official," she announced, sharing the latest good news. "Starting this fall, we'll be hosting veterinary students from 12 different schools for clinical rotations. Marcus, you've been invited to serve as an adjunct professor." The idea of teaching again filled Marcus with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. He had spent the past 4 years running from his former life, but now he was beginning to understand that his experiences, both the triumphs and the failures, could serve a greater purpose. "Emma always said she wanted to be a doctor like Daddy," he said softly. "Maybe I can help other young people fulfill that dream." The afternoon brought its usual parade of visitors, each group eager to hear the story of Bella's birth and Dorothy's sacrifice. Marcus had initially resisted the attention, preferring to work quietly in the background, but Crawford and Patricia had convinced him that sharing his story was part of his healing process. His presentations to visitor groups had become legendary, powerful testimonials to the possibility of redemption and the importance of choosing hope over despair. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began his afternoon talk, standing before a group of 200 visitors in the center's amphitheater, "6 months ago I thought my life was over. I had lost my family, my career, and my faith in myself. I came to Montana to hide from the world and wait to die." He paused, looking out at the faces in the audience, young and old, hopeful and skeptical, all searching for something meaningful. "But this place, these animals, and the extraordinary woman who brought us all together taught me that it's never too late for a second chance." He told the story again, never growing tired of sharing the details of that miraculous night. He spoke about Dorothy's wisdom, Crawford's forgiveness, and the trust that Bella had shown in allowing a broken man to help bring new life into the world. But most importantly, he spoke about the ongoing work of healing, both for the animals they rescued and the humans who found purpose in caring for them. After his presentation, a young girl raised her hand with a question that stopped Marcus in his tracks. "Dr. Thompson," she said, her voice clear and confident, "my daddy says that some people are too broken to be fixed, but you were really broken, and now you're helping other people get better. Does that mean everyone can be healed?" Marcus felt tears spring to his eyes as Emma's voice echoed in his memory. "Daddy, Will you save all the animals? The question from this stranger's daughter seemed like a message from beyond, a reminder that his work was far from finished. Yes, sweetheart, he answered, his voice strong with conviction. Everyone can be healed. Sometimes it just takes longer than we expect, and sometimes the healing looks different than we imagined. But love and forgiveness are powerful medicines, and they're always available to anyone brave enough to try them. As the sun set over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Marcus made his daily pilgrimage to Dorothy's memorial bench overlooking the preserve. The inscription read simply, "Dorothy May Henderson, she loved until the very end." Fresh flowers appeared there every day, left by staff members, visitors, and local residents who had been touched by her story. Crawford found him there, as he did most evenings, sitting quietly and watching the animals settle in for the night. "Tommy got his acceptance letter today," Crawford said, settling onto the bench beside his former enemy-turned-closest friend. "Full scholarship to veterinary school, plus an offer to spend his summers here as a research assistant." Marcus smiled, imagining the pride Dorothy would have felt at seeing Tommy's dreams come true. She'd be so proud of him. Of all of us, really. He looked toward Bella's enclosure where mother and cub were settling in for the night. "Sometimes I think she's still here, watching over everything she set in motion." "I know she is," Crawford replied without hesitation. "Every miracle that happens here, every life that gets saved, animal or human, it's all part of her plan. Dorothy May Henderson may be gone, but her love is eternal." As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Marcus felt a peace he hadn't experienced since before Emma's death. The guilt and self-hatred that had consumed him for 4 years had been replaced by purpose and hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new animals to heal, and new people seeking redemption. But tonight, surrounded by the legacy of an extraordinary woman's love, Marcus Thompson finally understood that healing was not just possible. It was inevitable for anyone brave enough to choose forgiveness over fear, service over selfishness, and hope over despair. The Dorothy May Henderson Center for Wildlife Rehabilitation and Human Healing would continue to grow and touch lives for generations to come, a living testament to the truth that one act of genuine love can indeed change the world. Dear friends, if you've lived through 6 decades like many of us have, you know that life doesn't always go according to plan. Maybe you've carried guilt from a mistake that changed everything. Perhaps you've lost someone precious and wondered if happiness could ever return. Maybe you feel like your best years are behind you, that it's too late for second chances or meaningful purpose. Marcus Thompson felt exactly the same way at 42, believing his life was over after losing his family. But in a frozen Montana cave, surrounded by broken people and wild creatures, he discovered something profound. It's never too late for redemption. Dorothy May Henderson, at 78, turned her final months into the most meaningful chapter of her entire life. Crawford found forgiveness after years of hatred. Even Tommy, paralyzed and seemingly defeated, discovered his true calling. Their story reminds us that our deepest wounds can become our greatest strengths, that the love we thought was lost forever can multiply when we choose to give it away. Age doesn't diminish our capacity for miracles. It deepens our wisdom to recognize them. What moment in your life taught you that healing was still possible? Have you found unexpected purpose in your later years that surprised even you? Please share your story in the comments below. Your journey might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.